Welcome everyone to attending today our session here at Melbourne Connect about inside clinical trials from research to treatment. My name is Sharon Kitt and I'm the Senior Program Manager here at the Australian Centre for Accelerating Diabetes Innovations, otherwise known as ACADI. So before we begin today's session, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, learn and live. The University also acknowledges and is grateful to the traditional owners, elders and knowledge holders of all Indigenous nations and clans who have been instrumental in our reconciliation journey. We acknowledge their enduring cultural practices of caring for country. We pay respect to elders past, present and future and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. So, ACADI. ACADI was a research centre established through the Medical Research Future Fund, funding from the Australian Government in 2023. ACADI is headed by Professor Alifa Kinchi, and our purpose is to deliver novel interventions for timely diagnosis, prevention and treatment of diabetes and its complications, particularly in the areas of diabetes-related kidney disease, diabetes-related foot disease, and complications of the extreme lows and highs of blood sugar. So, clinical trials. Clinical trials have a pivotal role to play in research. They are the cornerstone of medical innovation and getting new treatments available to the public. Clinical trials assist in developing new treatments, assist in understanding disease, and assist in ultimately improving care. However, what is a clinical trial? How do they work? How do you participate in one? And what are the results? That's what we're here to answer today. Over the next hour, our esteemed panel will explain the important role of clinical trials and address some of the common misconceptions and discuss the pivotal role they play. I would like to introduce the members of our panel now. First of all, we have Professor Richard McIsaac. Richard is a clinician researcher and is currently the Director of Endocrinology and Diabetes at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne and at the University of Melbourne. He is the Senior Principal Research Associate at the St Vincent's Institute of Medical Research, an Honorary Clinical Research Fellow at the Bionics Institute of Australia and the Diabetic Kidney Disease Co-Stream Lead of ACADI. Richard's main research interest is diabetes and its acute and chronic complications, especially those related to cardiovascular disease and kidney disease. Richard has published over 300 research articles and has a keen interest in the application of new medicines and technologies to improve outcomes in people with diabetes. Next we have Mariam Hatcham, is the Clinical Trial Manager of the FLASH study at the University of Melbourne and Austin Health. The FLASH study is Australia's first device randomised controlled trial for Indigenous Australians with type 2 diabetes and focuses on those living in urban, regional, rural and remote areas. Mariam has over 7 years' experience in diabetes research, public health and clinical trials and has a particular interest in health equity. Megan Reid is our Community Engagement Lead at Diabetes Victoria and works on the ACADI co-design platform. Megan brings to these roles 37 years of lived experience with type 1 diabetes, together with an experience in laboratory, clinical and pharmaceutical research. Her passions lie across many areas of diabetes, including elevating the role of lived experience in research and clinical practice, equitable access to information, treatment and technology for all people with diabetes, and the prevention of type 1 diabetes. Finally, we have Mr. Wayne Kelly. Wayne is the General Manager Sales at Brandon Hospitality Solutions. He joins us as someone who has participated in a clinical trial for a new medication. Wayne will bring you his first-hand account of being in a clinical trial from go to woe, and we look forward to hearing his lived experience perspectives today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Richard, who will MC the remainder of the session today, and we'll start off by explaining the ins and outs of clinical trials, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and welcome to everyone that's watching this presentation online or that's here in person today. Thank you very much for joining us. If a person has been involved in a clinical trial, thank you very much for your participation. If you're thinking about going to a clinical trial, well, hopefully after today's event, you might think more strongly about saying yes to an invitation to enter into a clinical trial. I'm what you would describe as a trialist. I run a number of clinical trials where I'm the principal investigator at St Vincent's. So that means the ultimate responsibility of the conduct of the trial, the care of participants in the trial falls on me, but of course I'm very reliant on people like Mariam to make sure that everything runs smoothly during a clinical trial. Well, as Sharon said, clinical trials are studies involving people. They can be healthy people or they can be people with a certain condition, and those people with a certain condition, we might be trying to answer a specific question related to a health outcome related to that condition. So clinical trials are the way that we've brought new medications, new devices, medical devices, or new approaches to treating people into everyday clinical practice. So there are a number of different clinical trials that we could talk about, but probably the ones that I've been most involved with involve randomisation of investigational medication or a placebo medication and looking at a specific outcome. So we can talk about that a little bit more in a bit more detail in a moment. So you might have heard about the different phases of clinical trials and how a new idea or a new medication might have worked its way through these various phases. So there's phase 1 clinical trials, which usually involves healthy participants, and Megan's probably had some involvement in these type of trials before. So that's really when we're trying to check out the safety of a medication. Maybe only a small group of healthy people. Usually it's backpackers, isn't it, Megan, that are looking to earn a little bit of money, because people usually get paid to be part of these studies. They might involve staying overnight to study a new medication, for example, its side effects and its safety profiles, what we're mainly interested in those phase 1 studies. So if a medication or a device gets a tick of approval in those phase 1 studies, then we move to phase 2 studies, which mainly look at the efficacy of an intervention, a medication or a different type of treatment or device. Typically these trials might involve somewhere from 100 to 400 people looking at some specific outcome. They might involve something in terms of the life of a medication in the body, its half-life. We might take a blood sample to see how quickly a medication, for example, is cleared from the body, but it might be looking at some specific outcome. So if we can show that the medication works well to maybe reduce, in my area, it's maybe reducing blood pressure or reducing sugar levels, then we can move on to the phase 3 of a trial, which is usually required by regulatory authorities in Australia, by the TGA, the Therapeutics Goods Association, to give a specific indication to a medication. So in the clinical trials that I do, that might be the prevention of cardiovascular death in people with diabetes. So we might be looking, pick a group of people with, say, type 2 diabetes, we might treat them with the medication or a placebo medication and then look to see how many people have achieved this particular outcome of interest. So if you can tick off on that, then you might be able to get your medication approved and it might come onto the market. So there might be some terminology that you hear associated with clinical trials. You might hear the term randomisation. So in a clinical trial, it's very important that we try and make sure that when we start the trial, a difference that we see at the end of the trial is not related to a difference in the participants in maybe the two groups that we're looking at, an interventional group with a medication or a placebo group. So we try and match people as well as we can, and usually in a big trial, some of the trials international trials that I'm involved with, there's a couple of thousand people in the trial, so it's usually just by chance into which group you go into. And usually if you've got enough participants, people balance out in terms of their age, their gender, usually sometimes going to be a little bit gender, and their other clinical characteristics. So that's randomisation. Controlled usually means comparison between two modes of investigation or treatment. In my case, usually that's randomisation to the active medication or placebo medication. Blinded can mean the participant doesn't know what they're taking. It could be placebo or an active medication. Double-blinded means the investigator also doesn't know. So a lot of the trials that I do, they're double-blinded, so I don't know what the person's getting. So that way I'm protected from maybe treating that person a little bit different if I knew exactly what they were getting. So most of the trials, we start up, we randomise people, get them on the active medication or placebo, which I usually don't know what it is. We bring trial participants in at regular intervals. We measure an outcome of interest or ask people whether they've developed an outcome of interest, and then we follow them through for a number of years. So if you go into a clinical trial, it's very important that you stay in the clinical trial, because the validity of the result that we find sometimes depends on the dropout rate. If a lot of people drop out of a trial, then people might say, oh, why do people drop out? Can I believe that your medication actually led to this result that you're claiming, or could it be due to something else? Were people dropping out because they couldn't tolerate the medication or some other factor? So very important you stay in the trial. You don't even have to stay on the medication or have the device, but we just need to follow people through to the end of the trial. So before people go into a trial, and we might hear about how Wayne, for example, was recruited to a trial, people might come in, they might see an advert, they might have their local doctor suggesting a trial, or they might see one of the trialists as part of their routine clinical care, and then be recommended to enter a trial. So if you're recommended to go into a trial, a good trial should make sure that you're entering the trial with your eyes open. You know what you're getting in for, you know what the intervention will involve, you know what the follow-up is going to involve, you know how many visits might be involved. So they're very important things to make sure that a participant is clear on, and that's what we go through before we get people to consent. So you've got to go through a consent process, so we have to make sure that people understand exactly what they're getting into by going into the trial, and that we answer any questions that people might have, and that they've had enough time to think about whether the trial's right for them or not. There's also very important oversight that happens in every trial. Once again, no point doing a trial if things aren't done properly and the validity of the results that we find can't be trusted. So before a trial can be started up, it usually has to go through, or the protocol for a trial has to go through an ethics committee. So they would tick off of the trial or say, you've got to amend this is not right, we don't like the way that this trial is being conducted, and say, okay, I can see there's a problem there, and you might make some adjustments to the thing. There's then, usually when a trial happens, there's a steering committee that oversees the overall conduct of the trial. There's usually a safety committee that will be alerted to any red flags in terms of bad outcomes for participants in a trial. So there's a number of oversights to make sure that a trial runs properly and the results that we find are valid and can be believed. So I'm doing a number of trials. Most of them are related, as Sharon said, to cardiovascular or kidney health. We're probably running 8 trials at the moment. I might oversee the trial. I've probably got some other endocrinologists in the department as co-investigators, maybe to cover when I'm not around, to see some trial participants. And then the most important people running the trial, of course, the trial coordinators, because they're the ones that have the day-to-day contact with the trial participants. So I think I've been very lucky in some of the trials that I've been involved in, because they've led to some very important outcomes being proven. You might have heard of the medication Ozempic, for example, is an injectable medication for type 2 diabetes. So I was involved in the trial that showed that Ozempic led to a reduction in cardiovascular outcomes in people with type 2 diabetes versus those treated with placebo injection during the trial. So that was a good trial to be involved with. There's another group of diabetes medications which now have indications outside of the diabetes sphere for heart and kidney protection, called the SGLT2 inhibitors. So I was involved in a trial involving that class of medication that showed good renal benefits and cardiovascular protection in people with diabetes. So it can be very rewarding for myself being part of the trial to see these good results coming out. But also, I think personally, it helps to keep me up to date with what's happening in the field, new medications, and I get a feel for a medication and how it works even before it comes onto the market. So there are many advantages, I think, being involved from my personal point of view with clinical trials. So, as I said, we wouldn't have new devices, new medications or new approaches to dealing with medical problems if it wasn't for clinical trials. And number one, we've got to believe the results of a trial so that we don't waste our time approving a medication or an approach or a device that's not going to be efficacious. So if that's okay, maybe we could... Should we ask for any questions at the moment, or we'll just go... What they... Mariam, why don't you tell us actually about the day-to-day running of a clinical trial and what your role is overseeing and managing clinical trials?
Thanks, Richard. So the day-to-day life of a clinical trials manager, I think my role is a little bit different because I still do get to see participants, which I love. So just to give you a background, the trial that I manage is based all around Australia, and it's specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have type 2 diabetes. It's using a device that is approved, so it's a wearable flash glucose monitor, but this device is only approved for people that have type 1 diabetes, not type 2. So the core of what we're doing is essentially looking at whether the flash glucose monitor is more effective in essentially helping people control their diabetes than the regular finger pricking, which is what people with type 2 have to do. So my role is essentially to oversee and make sure all the operations and logistics and the communications of the trial are running as seamlessly as possible. So a day in my life might look like doing an ethics amendment. So this means that I might have to change something in the protocol, or there's something that needs to happen. And so a lot of time is spent with ethics. But a lot of my role is actually about stakeholder management and communication. And if you see me in my office, I'm often talking on the phone with different people. I really like to talk to the study coordinators, who are the people that will see the participants on a day-to-day basis. So it's problem solving. It's a lot of thinking about what the challenges might be and how we can best address it. But also it's about adhering to the regulations that we have to adhere to when you're doing a clinical trial. So it's a very complex balance between being creative but staying within the bounds of the constraints that you have to work in, which is often the regulations and the ethics and all that, which is very important. But there is one thing that I'll just alert you to, which is about the consenting process, which is very important in a clinical trial. And I think a good way to demonstrate that creativity while staying within the bounds of the ethics and all that is how we've developed our consent video. So if you go onto YouTube and type in Flash Study Informed Consent, you'll see that we've designed a very innovative way of consenting in trials, which I think is quite new, particularly in this space, and that's to accompany the traditional processes. So that's also to help communication and all that stuff, which hopefully will flow onto the participants as well.
Yeah, so very important that people have a chance to think about the trial first and don't feel that they're being pressured or rushed into entering into a clinical trial, because usually that only has a bad outcome. You want to start off on a good note and make sure that people are going in with their eyes wide open and understand what the trial involves. You talked about some amendments to the ethics process, and I talked about the importance of getting the protocol through and making sure that an independent group of people have looked at it and think it's all reasonable and within the normal standard of care to start with, but it's adding something on top of that. What would lead to maybe an amendment in an ethics application?
So it could be, there might be a change to, I'm just having a think, a particular inclusion or exclusion criteria. So when we do a trial, it's designed very rigorously, and there's a set of inclusion criteria that we look at and we go, yes, you meet these, you can enter the trial, or there's a set of exclusion criteria that if you meet, unfortunately, you can't be in the trial. So an example might be something might change there, and we'll have to go through that process.
And it's always very difficult to gaze into the crystal ball and get everything right, even though everything looks quite reasonable. When the actual conduct of the trial is up and running, sometimes you feel, oh, actually, this might work. We have to make a tweak to maybe the number of visits, or sometimes even a new way of treating people comes in during your trial and you think, oh, this might influence the outcome of my trial or how I conduct the trial, and you have to maybe take that into account with your ethics application. So it's a live animal, isn't it, the ethics process for a clinical trial. What about recruiting people for trials? How did you recruit people for this particular trial you described to us?
So for this particular trial, I think it's quite different. So a lot of the trial recruitment is driven by the study coordinators who happen to be healthcare professionals at the services in which they're working. So I can think of one particular trial site which is up in Cairns. And the study coordinator there basically recruits them through the clinical visits. So they'll come in, they'll see him, and he'll go, hey, this is a really great trial that might help, and it falls within the realm of their clinical care. So that's how we've been able to recruit really well for this trial.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to anyway. Has there been a situation where someone, or you had to deal with a situation where someone said, I don't want to continue on in this trial? And maybe you could just maybe give some insight into why that was the case and some of the innovative ways you might have brought into play to keep the person involved in the trial.
So I can think of a few reasons. One is people might say, I can't attend all the visits. Travel is a barrier. Time is a barrier. So one suggestion that I've said is, well, we could conduct this visit via Zoom, or we could help cover payment for your transport. So there's always things like that. There's a fine line between coercion and people wanting to withdraw. But I think making trials more accessible is something that needs to be considered, because often that's a big barrier.
Sure. Well, we might move on then, because I think at the end we'll probably have some questions or things that we might discuss between the four of us when it comes to the conduct of a clinical trial. So Megan, what about looking outside of clinical trials and maybe having some oversight, not when you're not exactly directly involved or haven't got any vested interest in a trial? What's been your role there?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So my role is I currently work at Diabetes Victoria as a community engagement lead, and as part of that role, and because of my history in working in the research space, I've been heavily involved in what I like to term elevating the voice of lived experience in research. So I've been involved in a community-led research project, which is where we elevated the people with diabetes to lead the project. Now that's the absolute pinnacle. When we're talking about clinical trials of new medicines, I've got a really strong belief that people that live with diabetes are really the experts in their own care. And I think that people living with the condition have something to add to the way that clinical trials are conducted. Now, that might be, I think if you don't live with diabetes, there's things about it, the effects of medicines, and I use an insulin pump, that are not just about whether your blood glucose goes up, your blood glucose goes down, or it stays in a beautiful line. There's things about quality of life, things that make your life easier, things that make your life harder, the wearability of devices, the side effects of medicines. And I think involving people with diabetes at that early planning stage, and then keeping people with diabetes involved the whole way through the process, and with lots of people ultimately participating in a trial, can only lead to a really relevant clinical trial. So not only will you be able to prove that the medicine works, but you'll be able to prove that it is a drug or a device that's desirable in the population that you're studying. And I heard, and I wish I wrote down exactly who said it, but I saw a quote from one of the heavy hitters in US pharma who said that 100% of the time when they involve people with lived experience in the development of their clinical trial protocols, they recruit ahead of target. Now, I think that just says it all, really. If you involve people with lived experience in the process of designing our clinical trials, people with diabetes or people with the condition you're studying are more likely to want to be in that clinical trial.
Very good. It sounds common sense when you put it in that sort of frame, because of course when we're asking people to participate in a clinical trial, they're going over and above what is involved in the normal care. So we really want to try and make it as easy as possible, as convenient as possible for people to be participants in clinical trials, because as I've said before, clinical trials can't work unless we have trial participants. So we're very, very grateful if anybody participates in a clinical trial, because we know they're doing it on their own volition. They're giving up their time to come in, and we thank them for that. But we also talk to them about the fact as to why they might be doing the trial. They probably want to add to medical knowledge, and so that's a wonderful thing if we can get someone to be a participant in a clinical trial. And at the end of the trial, for a lot of the trials that I've done, as I said, they were randomised, placebo-controlled trials. We talked to the participant about what they were actually taking, whether they were taking the active medication or a placebo, for example. And some people are quite surprised at the fact they've been taking a placebo medication because they've done quite well. And that's sometimes an interesting thing to keep in our minds when we're talking to people about entering into placebo-controlled trials, because they say, well, you know, I might get the placebo. And I say to the person who's thinking about entering into a clinical trial, that's true, but this is exactly why we need to do placebo-controlled trials, because most people, when they enter into a clinical trial, their overall health improves. They've got an extra set of eyes overseeing things. They're probably taking more interest in their health, trying to do the right thing to impress or please the trial coordinator or the investigator. So that's why we need to, in a lot of trials, have the placebo arm to try and account for that fact. So that's what I tell people. You're going to win even if you're not getting the active medication. And as I said, some people are quite surprised to find out what they're actually getting, because they think they must be getting the active medication because they've done so well.
Richard, I think it's really important to note as well that if your health started to deteriorate during a clinical trial, that the investigator has an obligation to step in and alter the course of your treatment.
100%, Megan, and that's what I always tell everybody that comes in when I'm consenting them. I say, well, nothing is set in stone. We don't have to keep going with the conduct of the trial as it is in terms of taking an active medication, but please, we can stop that and we'll see if we can help to sort out what the issue is. So you might get more timely referral, off to have a scan or a blood test or a referral, even though a lot of the time we just have to be mindful we don't take over the clinical care of the patient. Usually that's left to their own treating physician, so that's why communication's very important. If that you keep the participant's general practitioner or another specialist up to date with what's happening with the trial, or the person's participating in a trial. But if we see something, we'll jump in and deal with it. So we've just got to be a little bit careful. That can sometimes be a little bit of a fine line to walk in terms of ownership of care, well, not ownership, but involvement in care of a person that's involved in a clinical trial. So yes, that's what we always tell people. And the other thing that we've got to be careful about, if we've got someone on a active medication and a placebo medication, for example, if that medication becomes available for maybe a certain indication, it might be the indication that we're looking for in the clinical trial, and it's on the market, we've got to make sure that there's no what we call contamination by people being prescribed the medication outside of the clinical trial sphere. So we've got that as a little bit of an issue at the moment, one of the trials that I'm doing, but good communication usually takes care of that problem. Now, shall we hear what it's like to actually be a participant in a clinical trial? Wayne, why don't you tell us maybe a little bit about your journey, how you got recruited into the trial, how you found the conduct of the trial. You can speak freely, we can edit bits out if but how you felt and how if you felt that you had a voice during the trial, and how things all ended up.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Richard. Hello, everyone. I've had diabetes for about 20 years now, and the first stage of diabetes is the acceptance of it, or the non-acceptance. The victim mentality comes in. Why me? Why did I get this? What have I done to deserve this? And then there's the panic that sets in, which is the fear of amputations, blindness, and everything else that you hear about, all the negative stuff. And you think, well, I've been working hard, I've been doing the right things, but I was an idiot. I had 2 businesses, and I used to start my day at about 6 a.m. I'd have regular eating patterns. I'd burn myself out. I was running on adrenaline. So you had financial worries. You had relationship worries because you don't see anybody at home. And when you do, you're cranky and tired, and so on. So my weight ballooned out to 115 kilos. And didn't feel good about myself, and then I was angry at myself, and all those emotions. So I probably went through about 2 or 3 GPs looking for someone who could help. There are a lot of GPs out there that said they could help with all good intentions, but didn't know what to do. So we're going back 20 years ago. So the mindset was probably a little bit different back then too. And it was more about treating than preventing or trying to reverse anything. So once I found the endocrinologist that I have now, Professor Elif, she basically saved my life, because it's not just a physical condition, it's a mental condition. And you need to change the mental approach to how you deal with it and live with it before you can do anything else. Once you get that set or reset, you're on your way. And what Zippertide has done for me is given me that opportunity to do that.
So that's the medication
That's
that was being trialled in this
Yep.
study that you're involved in.
Yep, so I'm 2 years into that trial. It's been a life-changing experience, and it's been easy to manage. It hasn't been inconvenient whatsoever. The consequences of being on the trial have been only positive. I haven't had any contraindications. Might have been nauseous a few times, but that was probably due to me pushing the boundaries, or not eating properly, or eating at the wrong times, all that sort of stuff. And that's the sort of stuff you learn along the way on how to manage yourself, you know. But my life now is pretty close to normal, as I could hope for. And I regard myself extremely fortunate.
Well, it's fantastic to hear. If you don't mind, could we maybe just drill down on some of the phases that you would have gone through as a participant in the clinical trial? So, to start with, recruitment. How were you? How did you hear about the trial, and how did you get started in the trial?
I had no idea about the trial. I was invited to participate in the trial. And that was because I'd probably say I was a long-term patient, and I'd got to a point where I'd reduced my weight and changed my lifestyle and eating habits, but I was sort of hit like a roadblock, couldn't get past a certain point. And Elif said, I'm going to invite you to participate. It's up to you. There's no obligation on your part, and we'll hold your hand and take you through it. And it's been probably one of the best things that's happened.
Okay, very good. So, identified for the trial,
Yep.
willing to participate. Then, do you remember the consent process that you would have gone through for the trial?
Yes, so I had an assessment, full assessment.
You would have signed the consent form first, probably.
Of course,
course.
absolutely. No, what form? Yeah, no, did all
so
that.
do you remember, going through the consent form and having
Yep.
to sign it, and
Yep.
getting the investigator or co-investigator signing off at the
Yes.
same time? And
So meeting the team, meeting the doctor running the trial, and also the coordinator, and working, strong relationship with those people.
very good. So you've signed the consent form. Then you mentioned the screening
Yep.
process, which I haven't talked about yet. But of course, we're looking for people in a lot of the trials that I do and Elif does, people with certain characteristics, and that could be clinical characteristics or biochemical characteristics. So sometimes when a person comes in, we have to say to them, thank you very much for coming in. I can't guarantee that you'll proceed to the next phase, which is actual, getting you ready for randomisation and enrolment in the trial, because you might miss out on a certain clinical criteria, or it's usually a biochemical criteria, because what happens in most instances, we take a blood sample and it gets sent off to a central laboratory where it's treated and measured in exactly the same way for all trial participants, so there's no local differences when it comes to this type of measurement. And if you tick those boxes, then we usually ring people up and say, well, guess what, you've got past the screening process, are you ready to be randomised and
Yep.
take the next step into the trial? So you would have gone through that, might have
Yep.
had a blood test and maybe a physical
Yep.
examination,
Yep, physical.
and then waiting around to be told whether you're the right type of person to
Correct.
participate in the
Correct.
trial.
And I'd also had a mild heart attack previously before joining, so there's a cardiovascular history in the family. So my father had his first heart attack at 36. So the DNA, the gene pool is fantastic. So I was in line for some cardio treatment, and he also had diabetes, as did my grandmother. So there was a predisposition there in the family. Just needed something to trigger it, and it was the stress from those businesses and all those other experiences that really was the catalyst.
Well, I'm glad to hear that things have worked out well
Yeah,
for you after
yeah.
hearing all of that. Then do you remember after passing through the screening phase to the actual signing up to the
Correct.
conduct of the trial and the randomisation
Yep.
procedure?
Yep. So probably about a 2-hour medical assessment, relevant tests, blood tests, and probably within about 2 weeks was confirmed that I'd been accepted into the program. Not knowing, what to expect beyond that, but I've got to say the team were really, really good in educating me as to what to do, how to handle situations.
And the trial that you were involved in
Yep.
most likely involved an injection of a substance once a week.
Correct.
Was that a big issue for you to think about or to...
No, not at all.
on?
Not at all. And that can be really intimidating for a lot of people, but you just have to suck it up, for want of a better phrase, And it's not painful, it's not invasive, it's not difficult. It's a simple, 2 steps. It's 3. Open the fridge, take out the vial, take the cap off, twist, jab, dispose.
So
Yeah.
just maybe to run through what might happen when you go to the fridge and open it up. So what's in there? There's a vial.
Oh, there's eggs. There's
Is there?
yeah.
Wrong question, Richard.
Sorry.
For the trial,
Sorry for
for
being
the trial medication, I knew you probably were stunned like that. For the trial medication,
Yep.
is there any labelling on it? Or
Yes, there is. Yeah. And you do need your glasses to read it.
Right, okay.
They chose
But you're
the
aware of the
smallest
fact that you don't know exactly what you're getting in the medication?
font. Correct.
Yes, okay.
Correct.
Right.
There's a lot of faith.
Yeah.
There's a leap of faith. Yeah.
Sure. So once we identified you for the trial, we've done the consent process, we've screened, tick into the trial, we've randomised you to 2 different forms of treatment
Yep.
that even the investigators don't know what you're getting.
No, that's
And,
right.
you don't know what you're getting, even though sometimes, as I said, we can be surprised as to what people are actually getting when we unblind the trial at the end of it. Then what sort of follow-up has participating in the trial involved? What sort of visits has this meant for you, or type of visits,
Well, this
and contact with the team?
This is very timely because yesterday I picked up my next 3 months' worth of supply, and the doctor on the trial, she did an assessment of me, and also...
So what did that involve, the assessment?
Well, it's a series of questions, of course. How you're feeling? Are there any experiences that you want to share with us, good or bad? But I, unfortunately, was pretty boring because I had no issues whatsoever. All down the page, it was no, which was the correct answer.
gold star then, and an elephant stamp.
That's
for
right.
good work,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. And then I was issued with the next batch. So, yeah,
And when's your next visit?
will
They've
be
been in-
on the 6th of December,
Rightio. Okay.
prior to Christmas, so we get that over the New Year period. Yep.
And have there been any issues or problems during the trial that you might have had to think about, oh, this is going to be a problem for me, I'm going away, or there's something that's come up, I can't make this set appointment, or I'm having a problem with the investigation or medication?
Yeah.
Is there anything
look,
there that...
in a
an
previous
issue?
role, I did a lot of travel.
Yep.
On aeroplanes, so you've got to take a cold pack where you can, or you've got to plan your travel so you don't travel when you're due for an injection, which was the most challenging part of it. So airlines are difficult to deal with because, you know, once you're carrying certain things, it's either go on the baggage hold or above, and the x-rays and all that sort of stuff. But because this is an insignificant needle, it doesn't even come up on the radar, so to speak. But the problem is you've got to be able to travel. So if you take an ice pack or something to manage the temperature, you know, you come across the people at the security control at the airports, and they're not the easiest people to deal with, you know. So, you know, once you overcome that, so that's why I'd turn and say, well, look, I'm not going to travel that day.
So, right, you've been able to work your way around it and adjust your schedule.
But as far as a negative, early days was probably a little bit of nausea,
Right,
some
okay.
vomiting, and I'd just put that down to the wife's cooking and
Living dangerously here.
living dangerously on the edge. Yeah. But, you know, I've had no issues whatsoever, and I couldn't understand. For me, it was so easy, and I couldn't understand. Sometimes I thought, were they being overcautious, or because I'm not experiencing any problems?
Well, that's great to hear. The trial probably overlapped a bit with COVID.
Correct.
Too, and can you maybe just give it, or Mariam might be able to give us some insights too here as to what some of the innovative approaches that were taken during COVID to try and keep the trial running and to keep participants safe and to make sure that they were following the trial protocols, once again for the validity of the trial, to make sure we're doing things right, but number one, making things work for participants in the trial.
Yeah, well, consultations with Alif, my endo, was quite okay. I think we might have done one by Telemed. And then when it came to picking up the drugs, it would have been easier to get into Parliament House than to get into the repat. So the protocol to get inside the hospital was they weren't using the QR code the government health department had done. They had to have their own. So you had another checkpoint, Charlie, to get through, and they were quite forthright on how they managed that, which was, you know, okay, I understand the situation, but, you know, a little overzealous, I think, sometimes. But in the end, got my drugs, and away we went. And then when it came to seeing Alif, we were able to, you know, do all the masking and preventative measures and get into the practice and all that sort of stuff. So whilst it was a challenge, we got around it, you know.
Yeah, I'm quite amazed that clinical trials have done so well during COVID. Mariam, any innovative things you want to tell us about?
Well, obviously there's a telehealth element, but I think the really good thing that we had at the Austin was that we were still able to see our patients. So it meant that if anything popped up, we were able to address it really quickly. And so we had to do a lot of it via Zoom, telephone, mailing out things. We just had to find ways to keep people safe, which was the most important thing.
Well, my trial coordinators even pick things up from people's homes on the way, like they do a urine collection. They'd leave it out on the front and they'd go beyond the call of what they normally have to do. They'd go and pick it up and put it in the fridge at home and bring it back the next day. So I think through everybody's good intentions and being innovative with our thinking, we managed to somehow keep things going. So maybe we've got about 10 minutes or so left. I don't know if anybody's got any questions that they want to address to the panel members and myself, or if anybody online has a way, maybe, I don't know if they've got online, they've got a way of, one way, okay, asking a question, but yeah, I'm sure we'd be very happy to entertain any questions that people might have. Yes. Hello.
Hello, hi. Thank you so much for such a fantastic panel session. This was really, really insightful. I just had a question about what drives and motivates all of you to do the work that you do in clinical trials. We've heard about the processes, the structures, but why do you do what you do? And what's the, we know that sometimes a clinical trial might not go past phases 1 and 2. So how do you keep that motivation when things get tough?
I think it's a very good question, because it's probably, for some of us, we probably see it as part of our core role. If you're working in a tertiary referral hospital, I think if you're in a department there, you should be involved in these things, because I might have mentioned before, it helps to keep you up to date with things. Because when we do a clinical trial, we quite often have a clinical startup meeting, so the other trialists all get together. We get to hear updates in the area, and we get to talk to each other. So I think that's very important. But as I might have also said, it gives us access to new medications, and even though we might know if it's a placebo-controlled trial exactly what someone's getting, but at the end of the trial we can say, oh yes, I know this really works well, I've seen it in practice. But also in the diabetes area, it's a really rewarding thing to be part of. For people with type 1 diabetes, we've got new devices, new ways of measuring blood glucose levels and other things in the bloodstream we can match together. You might have heard about this closed loop system. So just clinical trials involving that and ways to adjust things during exercise. We're involved in a lot of studies along those lines. The other studies I've been involved in with the new medications, like Wayne has been involved in. And it's just been a good area to work in at the moment, because there's so much happening in diabetes. There's new medications, new devices coming out all the time. And personally, if I see that, the results of a trial come out, I've been part of that trial, reduction in cardiovascular events by 24% in people treated with drug X, you think, wow, I was actually part of that and participated in that. I've seen it go through all the phases of development, all the way from the medication being developed, the early clinical trials, and then actually doing the big trial that shows a good outcome like that. It's really rewarding to be part of it, so I enjoy it too. And it is for someone like myself, an endocrinologist. It gives you maybe something a little bit different and refreshing to do during your working day. Go and see your trial participants. You're talking about the conduct of the trial. So yeah, I find it very rewarding. So that's my motivation. I don't know. Maybe we'll start at the end with Wayne, but.
Well, my motivation's quite obvious. I've got 2 options: live or die, and how are you going to die? So it's an easy decision for me.
Yeah, well. And you've seen good results as being part of the trial. Doesn't always work out so well. There are, as you said, there might be some trials that very disappointingly, despite all our efforts, we mightn't show an effect that we were looking for, but that's why you do the trial, and then the medication doesn't progress any further, but that's why we do it. So it is rewarding when something works out well though, but disappointing when it doesn't, or a trial has to stop early because of it's obvious that it's not going to work down the track.
But the people invited to the trial, they can't be half pregnant. They're either got to be committed to it 100% or not at all. Otherwise, it's not going to work. The results are skewed. Everything's just doesn't work out.
Couldn't agree more. And one of the big trials that I'm involved with is probably just starting to enter in its wind down phase, and the big catch cry at the moment is retention. Making sure that people are retained in the trial. that just means keeping contact with them. It doesn't mean they have to stay on the study medication. They can have a treatment pause, but we've just got to keep contact with them to know what's happened so we can, at the end of the trial, say X or Y did or did not happen to this person.
I think for Flash it's very clear, and the purpose is always the first thing that we talk about, and that's about just providing access to technologies for the people that need it the most. And I think that's what drives me, just that social justice element, that almost warrior of like, let's fight the system, and how can we do it? A clinical trial, which will hopefully influence and change policy.
And Megan, from your point of view, maybe the advocacy role, and
Yeah,
it's very important for you.
absolutely. I guess for me personally, keeping going in this space is all about the benefits that I've received. I've lived with type 1 for 37 years, and the management of type 1 diabetes now compared to 37 years ago is so much easier, and my lifestyle is so much better as a result. But all of these changes only possible due to clinical trials. And I guess as time goes on, and in the period of time I've been working in clinical research for longer than I care to admit, 15 to 20 years, and the role of the person living with the condition has changed significantly. And the other thing that I would say to anyone considering going in a clinical trial is that the clinical care that you get while you're a participant in a clinical trial is exceptional, and I would suggest that the regularity of the clinical care that you experience is probably better than you might get, particularly in a public health outpatient clinic. So there's some real benefits to the person with lived experience to participating in the clinical trial, but also I'd encourage people with lived experience to raise their hand and speak up about the conduct of clinical trials, and talk to the people that are running them about what, things they might have missed, things that would make a difference to you, and, and what these drugs or devices mean in real terms to your day-to-day existence.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your question. We've just got a question up the top there.
It's a simple question. How do you qualify which new technology is coming in? Because there's so much and so much medication. Because you must have a process within the tick box. Because I guess apparently you got 100 coming in, and you go, God. So you must have some sort of system which is you want to introduce within your trials.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good question, and I think we're very lucky at this point in time that we've got lots of offers to do clinical trials, because sometimes we're thinking, oh, where's the next clinical trial going to come from? But it's funny, it seems to happen in waves. So we look at a number of things. We might look at, number one, we'd look to see, do we think this is a good question really to answer, and do we want to be involved in it? If we get past that step, the other thing that we might think about, have we got another competing trial that's going on that might make it difficult to recruit for this particular trial if we're maybe got a bit of an overlap, maybe look at slightly different outcome, but the same trial participants might be a potential pool for people to be pulled into one trial compared to another trial. So competition within the trial, practicality of the trial, a company might, or an organisation might come to us with a trial and we'll say, look, listen, that all sounds very good, we'd like to do it, but we just haven't got the setup to measure those particular things that you're interested in us measuring, or we've got to collaborate with another department, and that might be just not working at the moment in terms of just a flow of work between the departments. So they're usually the things that we look at, but I think number one is an area that we're interested in, because we've got number one, we've got to be invested in the trial. We just can't look at it as something to keep the process going of clinical trials, even though that's an important thing to think about in your department or your organisation. So is it worth doing? Have we got competition in terms of recruiting for that particular trial? And is it practical for us to be a part of that trial? They're sort of processes I go through. I don't know, Mariam, is there anything else that you want to add to to that. Maybe when a leaf comes and taps you on the shoulder and says, oh look, I've just been approached about, this is what I would do. If someone approached me about a clinical trial, I'll go to Liz, who is our clinical trials lead coordinator, and I'll say, well, what do you think about this? You know, is it practical? Is this something we should get involved in? Sounds a good idea, but when push comes to shove, is it something we should really try and progress or not?
All right, thank you for those questions, and thank you very much to our panel today, Richard, Megan, Mariam and Wayne. It was a fascinating conversation, and I have a feeling it was a discussion that we could have actually gone on for a bit longer as well. So thank you very much for your time today, and please join me in thanking our panel.